billionaire sits alone at a fancy cafe, a glass of orange juice glistening in front of him. Everything is perfect, until a tiny voice says, "Sir, she put something in your juice." What happens next? Unbelievable. A 6-year-old boy, a deadly secret, and a moment that would change 2 lives forever. This isn't just a story. It's a lesson in truth, courage, and the power of a voice no one expected to matter. Stay to the end, because you won't believe who tried to kill him, and how a child with nothing ended up saving everything. Edward Voss didn't believe in luck. At 52, he'd built a life that existed far above it, crafted from sharp wit, relentless work, and the kind of strategy that left nothing to chance. He had built his wealth the hard way, from cramped apartments to corporate boardrooms, from selling broken-down condos to owning half of downtown Houston's skyline. Every move he made was intentional. Every sip of wine, every headline, every handshake, calculated. Which is why on that particular Tuesday morning, when the sun rose just above the reflective towers of the city, Edward sat exactly where he meant to be, at a sidewalk table outside Arden and Gray, one of the city's most exclusive cafes, the kind of place where the waiters wore gloves in summer and the butter came embossed with the restaurant's initials. He was alone. His driver waited in the black Bentley nearby. His phone rested screen down, deliberately ignored. He sipped his coffee slowly and watched the city move, each pedestrian, taxi, and pigeon playing its part in the symphony of an early downtown morning. Across from him sat a leather folder with an embossed gold seal. Inside, the final acquisition, documents to purchase a European defense tech firm. Price tag? $84 million. It was already wired, waiting on his signature, but something else sat on the table too. A tall, sweating glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. Gleaming. Cold. Slightly too perfect. He hadn't touched it. Not yet. He was halfway through reviewing, a clause about offshore patents, when a small voice cut through the clinking china and distant street noise. Sir, don't drink that." Edward blinked, lifting his gaze from the contract. At first he didn't see anyone. Then his eyes lowered slightly. There, standing just outside the decorative iron rail of the cafe patio, was a boy. A small black boy, maybe 6 years old. His skin was dusty, his shirt too large, the fabric faded at the seams. His shoes were mismatched. One sneaker, one sandal. His left hand gripped the wrought iron tightly, and his right pointed directly at the juice. Edward stared at him, frowning. "What did you say?" The boy's eyes were large and panicked. She put something in your juice." Edward followed the child's pointing hand toward the restaurant doors. A waitress was retreating through the glass entrance, tall, in a crisp white shirt, navy apron tied at the waist. She glanced back once, just once, then disappeared into the kitchen. Edward's brows furrowed. "Are you playing a prank?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. The boy shook his head violently. "No, sir, I swear. She looked around first like she didn't want nobody to see, but I saw her. She had a little bottle, like the kind medicine comes in. She opened it real fast and then she poured it in your juice." Edward looked down at the glass. It hadn't moved. He tilted it slightly. The orange color looked thicker than usual. There were tiny pearled bubbles lining the inner rim, just barely visible. He didn't drink it. Instead, he stood up, slowly, deliberately. The boy stepped back instinctively, as though expecting to be yelled at. "It's okay," Edward said, voice level. "You did good." He pulled his phone from his coat and tapped a number. "Katie," he said calmly to his assistant. "I need building security at Arden and Gray Cafe immediately, full lockdown, nobody in or out. There may have been an attempt on my life." Less than 5 minutes later, security vehicles began arriving. The cafe owner, red-faced and stammering, was ushered out by 2 guards. Customers were confused, some filming with their phones. A few tried to leave and were stopped politely but firmly. By the time they reached the kitchen, the waitress was already gone. Surveillance footage showed her leaving through the back hallway. Just 2 minutes before Edward's call. She moved calmly, confidently, like someone who knew the angles, the blind spots, the escape routes. Whoever she wasn't just a waitress. Edward had the glass of juice sealed and handed off to private forensics. His legal team would follow up with police, but he didn't trust the system to move fast enough. The boy was now sitting in a quiet side office next to Edward, sipping from a juice box given to him by one of the cafe managers. His name was Zion. He was 6 years old. His mother, Sarah, worked as part of the overnight cleaning crew for the office building next door. She'd brought him along that morning and let him sit near the back hallway with a book while she finished her shift. He hadn't meant to be in the cafe at all, but he'd seen the woman, and he had spoken up. "Zion," Edward said, crouching, in front of him now. "You didn't have to tell me. You could have just walked away. Why didn't you?" Zion looked down at his hands. Because my mama says to always tell the truth, even if it's scary." Edward blinked. In that moment, the fear, adrenaline, and noise around them all melted away. He saw not just a child, but something rarer: integrity, courage, in its purest form. 3 hours later, the lab confirmed the contents of the glass: antifreeze, mixed with a sweetener compound to mask the taste, a clear, odorless poison, lethal over time. Symptoms wouldn't appear for at least an hour: fatigue, nausea, confusion, followed by kidney failure. Eventually, death. It was designed not to draw attention, designed to allow the target to move through their day, unaware they were dying. Edward's blood ran cold. If he had taken even 2 sips, he might have collapsed during his flight to Chicago that evening, or worse, while driving home alone. The kind of death that looked accidental, the kind of crime that didn't leave witnesses, but someone had witnessed. Zion. Later that night, when the cafe was closed and the buzz had died down, Edward returned. He didn't bring cameras, no press. He asked to see the cleaning crew. Zion was there again, this time holding his mother's hand. She wore a gray janitor's jumpsuit, her hair pulled back tightly. She looked surprised to see him. Embarrassed, even. "I'm sorry if my son caused trouble," she said immediately. Edward held up a hand. "He didn't cause trouble," he said. "He saved my life." Sarah blinked, her jaw trembling for a second. "I didn't raise him to be in the way," she whispered. We don't always have a choice." Edward looked at her, then at Zion, and something shifted. This wasn't about gratitude anymore. It was about truth, about what it meant when one child with no power, no protection, and no voice in the system did the right thing when the world least expected it. He knelt beside Zion one more time. "You did something brave today," he said, "and I won't forget it. Neither would the world." Because the next morning, Edward Voss called a meeting, not with shareholders, not with his board, but with his attorneys. He didn't want to send flowers or a thank you card. He wanted to change the boy's future, and quietly, with no headlines or fanfare yet, he began to make arrangements. But what he didn't know, not yet, was that Zion had not only saved his life, he had changed it. Forever. Edward Voss sat alone in the back seat of his Bentley as it rolled through the city streets, but his thoughts weren't on the morning's deal anymore. The numbers, projections, mergers, all of it blurred now, reduced to background noise. His hand rested on the folder containing the lab report. Confirmed presence of ethylene glycol. High probability of antifreeze compound. Sublethal dose ingested would begin renal failure within 60 to 90 minutes. He reread the sentence 5 times. He hadn't been afraid when it happened. Edward Voss didn't get afraid. But now, as the reality of how close he'd come to dying crept over him like a slow fog, he felt something else entirely: gratitude and guilt. That night, long after the city's suits retreated to their penthouses, and the neon glow of skyline turned into a hush, Edward found himself parked in a part of town he hadn't visited in 20 years. No valet, no reservations, Just cracked sidewalks, graffiti-tagged walls, and a laundromat that stayed open past midnight. It was where Sarah and Zion stayed. A small 3-story building with shared plumbing, creaky floorboards, and doors with 3 different locks. He didn't knock. Not that night. He just sat in his car, staring at the window where a soft light glowed behind a sheet used as a curtain. A shadow passed every so often. Zion, probably playing with that red plastic toy he'd carried like treasure. Edward thought about how many times he'd walked past people like them. In airports, in boardrooms where janitors mopped around designer shoes, in hotels where cleaning staff greeted him with lowered eyes, invisible, until they saved his life. The following morning, Edward made the call. Cancel Zurich, he told his assistant, and push back the Boston signing. I need a full day. Katie didn't argue. She had never heard that tone before. Calm, deliberate, but unsettled. An hour later, Edward walked into a public school just 12 blocks from where Zion lived. It wasn't a press visit. He told no one except his security detail. He asked to speak with the principal, and he asked to see the first grade classroom roster. Sir, the principal said nervously, we do appreciate your support of the district, but we typically don't give out student details. I'm not here to intrude, Edward said, laying down his card. I just want to understand what this neighborhood gives a kid like Zion, and what it doesn't. The woman's face softened. A few moments later, she placed a small stack of folders on the desk. Fewer than 40% of students tested at grade level. 1. Social worker for every 300 children. Only 1 functioning computer lab, and it had been broken into twice in the past year. They had no breakfast program, no dedicated after-school safety support, and no full-time guidance counselor. Zion, like most of the kids there, lived in the space between neglect and survival. If his mother hadn't taken the night cleaning job at Edward's downtown tower, their names might never have passed through his world. Edward left that building angry, not at the school, but at himself, at the system he'd helped build, one where people like him could walk into cafes worth $500 a plate, while children like Zion were drinking from broken fountains. He called Katie again. I want full background checks on Sarah Amani, on Zion, financials, living conditions, educational records if available. There was a pause. Are you thinking of adoption? She asked hesitantly. Edward's lips quirked into something like a smirk. No. I'm thinking of responsibility. By week's end, Edward arrived at a smaller cafe. No chandeliers, no security. Just a chipped ceramic counter and 3 scratched tables near the window. Sarah was already seated, Zion beside her. He wore a new jacket, too large for him, donated by a local shelter. When Edward entered, both stood automatically. You don't need to do that, he said, motioning for them to sit. Sarah looked guarded. I didn't expect to hear from you again, Mr. Voss. Edward nodded. That's understandable. He turned to Zion, who was now half hiding behind his mother's elbow. You remember me? Zion nodded shyly. You still telling the truth? Edward asked. Zion smiled a little. Always. Edward turned back to Sarah. I'm not here to repay a favor. What your son did, it can't be repaid. But I'd like to invest in something, in both of you. She blinked. In what way? In his future, Edward said. In yours. It began with housing, a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood, close to a charter school with strong literacy programs. Edward paid for the first 2 years up front anonymously. No reporters, no cameras. Then came school enrollment, medical coverage, a tutor twice a week. He also arranged for Sarah to receive full-time employment, not as a janitor, but as a facilities coordinator for one of his mid-level properties. Better hours, full benefits. She cried when she got the offer. Edward didn't say much. He was still trying to understand how a moment of kindness, a truth spoken by a child, had so thoroughly unmoored his world. But it didn't stop there. A week later, Edward met with his legal team and unveiled a plan. A new philanthropic arm of the Voss Foundation. the Truth First initiative. It was to be launched under Zion's name. Its mission: to recognize and support children in underserved communities who demonstrate integrity, bravery, and ethical courage, even in environments where telling the truth is discouraged or dangerous. Scholarships, counseling, mentorship programs, safe reporting networks. If this kid hadn't spoken up, Edward said, I'd be dead. But what's even more terrifying is how many kids are out there who don't speak, who don't feel safe to. He looked around the boardroom. We're going to change that. As weeks passed, Edward found himself thinking less about quarterly earnings and more about school lunches. He started spending time at community centers his company had long ignored. He asked questions, he listened, and he began to hear stories about kids like Zion who had been silenced, who had seen abuse, corruption, neglect, and been told to stay quiet. He thought about the waitress, about the fake ID, the vanishing act. The precision of the poisoning FBI report suggested she had been a contract operative, possibly foreign, possibly domestic. Edward had made enemies during a zoning decision involving an influential political donor. The attack wasn't random, but what was random, what they hadn't counted on, was the one child sitting quietly near a service door, the one they didn't see coming. 1 month after the incident, Edward invited Sarah and Zion to dinner, not at a 5-star restaurant. At his home, he wore jeans, cooked himself, grilled chicken, rice, vegetables, burned the bread. Zion laughed when the smoke alarm went off. It was the first time Edward heard him giggle. He would remember that sound for years. Later that evening, while Sarah helped clean the dishes, Zion sat on the porch with Edward, their legs swinging off the wooden steps. Can I ask you something? Zion said, licking chocolate off his fingers. Sure. Are you rich? Edward laughed. Yeah, I suppose I am. Does that mean you never get scared? Edward paused. No, it means I know when something's worth being scared of, and when it's worth being brave instead. Zion tilted his head. Like when you almost drank that juice? Edward nodded. And like when you warned me. Zion leaned back on his elbows, his small chest rising and falling slowly in the evening breeze. I'm glad you listened. So am I, Edward whispered. That night after they left, Edward stood by the window watching the tail lights of the cab disappear. He thought of legacy, of truth, of the strange, unpredictable threads that tie strangers together. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing with clarity. He owed his life to a boy the world nearly forgot, and now he would never forget him, not ever. 6 months had passed since the morning that nearly ended Edward Voss's life. And yet, as he sat on stage at the packed auditorium in D.C., with cameras flashing and murmurs from some of the most powerful people in America echoing off the walls, he wasn't thinking about the headlines or the investors or the bottom line. He was watching a boy, a small boy in a navy blue blazer, his legs barely reaching the edge of the chair, fidgeting with a microphone clutched in both hands like it was a sacred object. Zion Amani. The boy who had saved his life with 6 words, the boy who changed it with 2. She did. The event was the official national launch of the Truth First initiative, now operating in 19 cities, funded with $40 million from the Voss Foundation, and quickly gaining traction as a model for ethical education and youth empowerment. Its mission had already sparked citywide youth summits, anonymous safety lines in public schools, and even a pilot program in 3 juvenile facilities to educate young people about the power of truth in dangerous systems. But today wasn't about statistics or check amounts. It was about a story. And Edward knew there was only one person who could tell it. So he leaned forward, gently tapped Zion's shoulder and whispered, "Whenever you're ready." Zion stood slowly, just tall enough to see the podium over the top. The room fell silent. He swallowed once, then spoke. "My name's Zion. I'm 7 now. When I was 6, I saw something that didn't look right. I saw a lady pour something into a man's drink while she thought nobody was watching. My mom always told me, the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always right. She also says truth is like water. It might be quiet, but it always finds a way. So I told him. I said, sir, she put something in your juice, or I was scared. But I thought if I said nothing, something worse might happen. And I was right. That man didn't drink the juice, and I guess that man was important. A light chuckle rippled through the audience. But to me, he was just a man who needed help. Sometimes big people forget to look around. But I was there. I saw it. And I spoke up. He paused. Then added softly, "That's all." The applause came gently at first. Then louder. A full standing ovation. Edward stood last, his eyes glistening. Later that evening, as they sat on a quiet, rooftop balcony overlooking the Potomac, Edward handed Zion a small velvet box. Zion looked up, curious. "Is it candy?" "Better," Edward smiled. Inside was a silver compass engraved with 4 words: truth, courage, vision, legacy. Zion ran his fingers over it. "You use this when you get lost," Edward explained, "but not just on roads, in choices, in life." Zion squinted. "What if it stops working?" "Then you remember what your mom taught you. You remember that moment you saw something wrong, and you didn't walk away. That's your real compass. This." He tapped. "The box just reminds you what's already inside." Meanwhile, back in the shadows of corporate warfare and politics, the attempted poisoning case was still unresolved. Despite weeks of investigation, the woman who posed as a waitress remained unidentified. Interpol flagged the ID as part of a network used in black market passport trades. Surveillance showed she had trained movement, calmness under pressure, possibly military, possibly mercenary. But whoever had ordered the hit had done so with layers of insulation, ghost LLCs, burner phones, shell addresses. Still, Edward had a hunch, and hunches to a man like him were never left alone. He dug deeper, launching a private investigation team that worked separately from law enforcement. Their findings pointed toward one name: Harlan Creed, a billionaire real estate mogul, ruthless competitor, and the man who had been pushing a controversial coastal development deal that Edward had publicly blocked 2 months prior. The deal was rumored to include bribes, land grabs, and environmental violations. Edward had opposed it at a state senate hearing. Quietly, but effectively, and apparently Harlan hadn't taken rejection well. But there was no hard evidence. Yet, rather than retaliate with legal firepower or media exposure, Edward did something unexpected. He exposed the truth another way. The Truth First initiative launched a citywide ethics challenge across 6 school districts. Students were invited to submit real-life stories of when they witnessed wrongdoing and what they did about it. Winners would receive scholarships, school grants, and recognition. One story stood out. A girl named Lola, 13, had been working part-time under-the-table cleaning yachts in the marina. She saw men offloading crates late at night. Unmarked. No logs, no customs. She reported it anonymously through the new Truth First safety line. Federal agents raided the marina 3 weeks later and seized nearly $8 million in smuggled contraband. Turns out the ships belonged to a private fleet under Harlan Creed's investment firm. The press devoured the story, but the best part? The truth came not from courtrooms but from children, the kind of children the world used to overlook. One afternoon, Edward stood on the same cafe terrace where it had all begun, where the glass of juice had nearly become his obituary. He looked at the new plaque they'd installed discreetly near the door. To the one who noticed, to the one who spoke, the smallest voice can save the greatest soul. In honor of Zion, Amani Zion didn't want statues or trophies. He just liked stories. So Edward gave him one. In every school where the Truth First initiative expanded, they printed a simple illustrated booklet titled "The Day I Spoke Up." It told Zion's story in drawings, no names, no wealth, no suits, just a boy who saw something wrong and made it right. The final page read, "What would you do if no one believed you? What would you say if no one asked? What would you change? If you knew the truth could." Years passed. Zion got taller. His mother, Sarah, went back to school and became a certified building manager, then trainer, then consultant. She eventually led a citywide custodial reform task force to raise wages and conditions for all contracted workers. She even gave a TEDx talk. Edward Voss, meanwhile, gave up 40% of his board seats, stepped away from 3 Fortune 100 companies, and turned the Voss Foundation into a global force for grassroots empowerment. And every year, on the anniversary of the juice incident, as they jokingly called it, he and Zion met for dinner. Just the two of them. No cameras, no titles, no security. Just Edward and Zion. Man and boy. Saved and savior. One evening, when Zion was 11, they met on a cold winter night, bundled in scarves and sipping hot cocoa. Zion, now more confident and a little taller, looked across the table. Edward? Yes? Do you ever think about what would have happened if I didn't say anything? Edward nodded. All the time. Zion frowned. And what do you think? I think... Edward exhaled, watching steam rise from his cup. The world would have lost a man still pretending to be alive. Zion blinked. I thought you were alive already. Edward smiled. Turns out I was just rich. You helped me become real. Years from now, people might remember Edward Voss as a titan of industry, a name in financial archives. But the real legacy was what he built after a child tugged his sleeve and said 6 words, a story that reminded the world. That courage isn't always loud, that justice often starts quietly, and that truth, when spoken by the smallest voice, can stop even the deadliest poison, not with power, not with force, but with a whisper that said, "Sir, she put something in your juice." The end.